Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. I'm Amanda Duman, I'm the Dean of the school, and I'm very happy to see you here for our Dean's Leadership Series. As a co-founder and co-principal investigator of the Arab Barometer, I am deeply appreciative of the value and importance of public opinion. Insights about the social, political, and economic attitudes and values of ordinary citizens inform national conversations and policy debates. They help policymakers determine what will have broad public support and what won't. I was delighted to learn that Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin accepted our invitation and would be coming to Princeton Spear to speak with us. Dr. Scheindlin is a leading expert on political trends in Israel and Palestine, public opinion research, and conflict resolution. A Tel Aviv-based American-Israeli political consultant, pollster, and journalist, she has advised and conducted research on 8 national campaigns in Israel over the last 20 years, and has provided research and advisory for elections, referendums, and civil society campaigns in 15 different countries and regions. Dr. Scheindlin previously worked as a senior analyst for the Washington-based global firm Greenberg Quinlan Rosner Research, as a director of international campaigns at GCS Issue Management, and as a researcher at the Israel Democracy Institute. As an independent consultant, she conducts extensive public opinion and policy research on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and peace process. Dr. Scheindlin also consults on the issues of democracy, human rights, minority relations, religious identity, Arab-Jewish relations, and foreign affairs. She conducts the ongoing joint Israeli-Palestinian Public Opinion Survey together with the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research based in Ramallah. Thank you to Deborah for joining us today, and to everyone in attendance. Thanks as well to Princeton SPIA's Daniel Kurtzer, the S. Daniel Abraham Professor of Middle East Policy Studies and a former U.S. Ambassador to both Israel and Egypt, for moderating. I'm looking forward to a stimulating discussion on the shifting political landscape, public sentiment, and the prospects for the future in this time of deep uncertainty and transformation in the region. Dan, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Jamal. I want to add one note of introduction before we launch. Dahlia Scheindlin is my go-to person for everything about Israel, so we're in for a treat today. Dahlia, I want to start at 30,000 feet, and then we're going to come down to earth because there's a very target-rich environment given what happened starting last night in Gaza, the potential firing of the head of Shin Bet, Itamar Ben-Gvir coming back into government. There's a whole range of issues to cover. But why don't you give us a kind of broad overview of the mood? Is Israel still in trauma? Is it post-trauma? How to get out of it? To what extent do Israelis see Palestinians these days? And if they do, how do they see them? Frame the issue if you could.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank everybody for hosting me. Thank you to Dean Jamal and the entire school for hosting me. And I think that you had something to do with it personally. Thank you. The overall 30,000 feet view and also the immediate on the ground view is very, very negative. The environment in Israel, and I don't know how much this comes across, it is anything but euphoric. It's a bad time. What we're seeing in public opinion surveys that track things like optimism over the future of the country, over the future of security, over the future of democracy, the economy, is that a majority think the country is going in a negative direction on all of those issues, or they are not optimistic about the future of those things. The minority is, not 2%, 30, 40%. But overall, the mood is very bad. And that's just survey research. So on the street, just to really start it off conversationally, there are no conversations that don't eventually lead back to what's going on. And it's usually a pretty short minute to get there. If you overhear people talking, or if you just go into any social environment, there's a heaviness. Everybody knows somebody lost somebody, or people are displaced. Everybody has a personal connection to it. So the mood is definitely not good. In terms of the war, I think we also, to bring this up to right now, but something that we've been seeing for about at least 6 months now, is that confidence in the war aims, and in Israel's ability to achieve those aims has been declining over time. And I think this is probably comparable to protracted wars in other countries as well. Over time, people lose the rallying effect. We saw survey research from the Institute for National Security Studies, for example, from the first week or 2 weeks after October 7th, showing that 92% of the Jewish population thought the IDF would win. That's down to the mid 60% range, which has just been a kind of incremental decline over time. We see a similar decline in the portion of people who think Israel can achieve the goals in the war. And that data is backed very consistently by people repeating the idea that we don't really know what the war aims are. They're too vague. And they don't trust the government that they can get there based on what's going on the ground. So especially talking to people who serve, reservists, who are on the ground, and people who are experiencing it, they feel the lack of focus and specific aspects of those war aims that they're not well enough defined. They feel it operationally. And so, and then combined with the fact that none of this has helped to bring the hostages back, we see declining morale for the war. We also see a decline in the rates of reservists who are showing up for their call-ups. Okay, it's not to the level of crisis, but it's certainly much lower than it was in the beginning, and it's been an incremental decline over time, and every officer has noted that. So that's in terms of the war, which is just, notable on a day when the government is coming closer than ever to restarting the war. I say closer than ever because if you asked me at 9:30 last night, I would have thought the war has completely begun again, but I think we're still hedging it to see just how extensive this operation will be. Another thing I want to point out is that if there is declining morale in the war, declining confidence in the war aims, and high support for a ceasefire that will include a hostage release, and support keeps rising. Right now, according to the Israel Democracy Institute polling, support for the second phase of the ceasefire deal that was originally negotiated would have been 73%, okay, and it's gone up over time. And that the wording of that question even said, with a full cessation of hostilities and withdrawal of Israeli forces. But this is not out of concern for Palestinians. This is not out of concern for the situation of Gaza. It's not on people's minds. It's primarily about the hostages and war fatigue. And overall, this escalation, beginning on October 7th, but of course long before that, has led to hardening of attitudes. In general, over the years, actually that's a slightly outdated by 25 years of polling, not just 20 years, time goes on, it's amazing. After 25 years of polling and an unfortunate number of escalations over time, we see that all escalations lead to more hardline positions. Among Israelis, we have parallel trends among Palestinians. During every Gaza war, support for Hamas goes up and then drifts back down. So we see the same thing among Israelis, very hardline attitudes in terms of lower support for anything to do with peace or concessions or a two-state solution, higher support for militant and hardline political approaches. So that's another point that I think is prominent in the Israeli environment right now. Just one or two more points, I think, to set the stage. There are so many Israeli attitudes that look very belligerent, right? High support for the war, lack of attention to casualties. We see this in the numbers and we see this day to day in conversation. What we also see are parallel trends among Palestinians. I do bring in the Palestinian side because I conduct joint public opinion studies. I'm not saying this in order to suggest the symmetry of the political dynamic of political power, military power, economic power. Israel is vastly stronger, but the data is uncanny. We see very precise parallel trends in terms of, again, that hardline shift during escalation, support for each side's militant attitudes, and declining support for peaceful resolution of the conflict, etc. And the last thing I would say is that all of this goes along with a deep sense of distrust in the political leadership. We've had some, just to give you the most stark example, I'm sure everybody knows what happens in wartime to the national sentiment with relation to your political leadership. What happened after September 11th? Support for George W. Bush went way up. What happened to Zelensky's rating when Russia invaded Ukraine? It went way up. People were pretty disgruntled. What we saw in Israel was the opposite. Support for the government crashed to unprecedented lows. The coalition lost about a third of its support in every survey. The prime minister lost personal support and lagged further behind the competitors than ever in the last 15 years. And then over time, the government regained some of that support. So there's But on the other hand, there's still a majority who opposes most of what the government has been doing in terms of avoiding a hostage release deal, avoiding a commission of inquiry. Netanyahu staying in power, we have a majority who would like him to resign either during or after the war. And also the policies that preceded the war, which is the judicial reform. So there's a lot of distrust in the political level and a lot of uncertainty. Nobody really knows when there will be elections. Maybe they will not really be until the scheduled time, and nobody knows what will happen when they are held. But I think that there has been a breach of the social contract, and I think that Israelis will be kind of processing what that means for them for years to come. I'll stop there for now. I'm sure you can.
As I said, it's a target-rich environment. Let's start with the domestic politics. We talk a lot in this country about the question of whether there are guardrails to democratic backsliding. Bret Stephens, whom I don't often quote, talked about democracy dying in dumbness, that people are not paying attention and they don't understand. There's a kind of parallel, almost a mini-me type situation going on, where Israel is either mimicking what's happening here, or the administration here is mimicking what's happening there. What is the state of play in democracy with regard to the possible reappearance of the judicial overhaul effort, which at least two ministers, the justice minister and the foreign minister, want to do? Are we going to see a reappearance of that crisis?
Okay, well, I would say for one thing, it never went away. The judicial overhaul, for people who don't, who aren't involved in the ins and outs, it began in early January, days after this current government was established in early January 2023. And the government announced a series of reforms that would have severely curtailed the independence of the Israeli judiciary as a whole, not just the Supreme Court, but attacking the Supreme Court, re-engineering the Judicial Appointment Committee, replacing legal advisors with loyalists, and trying to change Israel's legislation to curtail what the Supreme Court can rule on, and essentially cramp judicial review in all possible ways. And when the war, and there were huge protests over the course of 2023 against it, which that goes into a longer background, which I want to draw on to answer your question about the U.S. factor. But just to start with the more immediate, when the war broke out, it would have been the 40th straight week of protests, mass protests that regularly had between 200 and 300,000 participants. Every single week for 39 weeks, it would have been the 40th week, and everything stopped. But the judicial reforms that were on the table also basically paused. Symbolically, they also seem to have stopped because the one piece of the legislation that they managed to pass was then overturned by the Supreme Court on January 1st, 2024. So some people thought that the judicial reform was dead. And people said this in the beginning of the war. At least the judicial reform is dead. But what the government did immediately when the war broke out was begin achieving its aims in other ways. In other words, the judicial overhaul was always essentially a vehicle to try to pass policies that would have been constrained by an independent judiciary, policies that violated the principles of democracy, liberal democracy, civil liberties, policies to advance a more theocratic society, to protect possible corruption and corrupt figures in government, to establish a more consolidated rule of the executive, and ultimately to advance policies like annexation of the West Bank, which this government has been explicit about from its establishment in late December 2022. It's in the published governing guidelines. All of those things would have required weakening the judiciary. That's why they were doing it. So instead of waiting to be able to weaken the judiciary, they rushed ahead with some of the policies and legislation piecemeal, right away from the beginning of the war. And war is a great excuse, for example, to curtail the process rights, right? Because you have to sweep up a bunch of people being captured in Gaza and hold them prisoners, and anybody with all Palestinians or Hamas or Nukba fighters who were captured on October 7th, you had to have legislation for holding them permanently. So one of the first things the government did was pass emergency legislation, the kind of thing that violates civil liberties, but you get away with it in wartime. But then from there, the government went on to continue appointing political loyalists and trying to get rid of professional level of figures within government and passing legislation to stifle civil society, constrained to the point of possibly putting some of the NGOs who are critical of the government out of business, Of course, media crackdowns, we can't, last night I was tracking Al Jazeera, who was doing live updates of the Israeli airstrikes. I can't get Al Jazeera's website in Israel now. You can't get it because Al Jazeera has been banned from Israel or the West Bank. So all of those things were continuing. And of course, the expansion of Israel's bureaucratic and military and settlement control in the West Bank is going on all the time. Bureaucratic is also a change in the actual legal structure of how the West Bank is governed. All of that is going on all the time, and there is less and less attention to it. And they just aren't waiting to weaken the judiciary. It's kind of do all the policies and see how fast the judiciary can respond and continue demonizing in other ways. So right now, we're not only facing the potential sacking of the head of the Shin Bet, but just a week before that, the government announced it was going to start proceedings for firing the Attorney General. The Attorney General, who has approved 90% of what this government does, but occasionally pushes back on some of the more egregious violations. So all of that has been ongoing the entire time. But I do want to also answer your question about how it relates to the US. And here I would say, I don't know who started it, but Israel's, I think, current iteration of what can really be considered somewhere between, in a piecemeal kind of series of attempts to weaken the judiciary into full-out assault on the judiciary began in the Knesset term between 2009 and 2013. That's when we started to see attempts by the government to pass legislation that would allow the Knesset to override the Supreme Court and talk about re-engineering the Judicial Appointment Committee. And then through the decade, an increasing, higher and higher volume of attacks, verbal, rhetorical attacks coming from the political level to delegitimize the Supreme Court, the Attorney General, eventually the state prosecutors, certainly as Netanyahu's corruption cases went on. And this became very methodical. And so it was going on for 14 years by the time what we call the judicial overhaul was actually announced. And it involved a lot of the rhetoric that you see not only in America, but in other countries. In Europe, for example, facing nationalist populism that tries to consolidate power in the hands of the executive. We see it in Hungary, we see it in Poland. Those are the big cases for comparison. So I think that this is part of a global phenomenon, but Israel is able to justify it very much on the back of an ongoing, military occupation and ethno-national conflict, which always justifies, the security angle, and the court, if it ever tries to preserve rights, it comes at the expense of our security. People in Israel now who are supporting the government are saying that if there is to be an investigative committee, they should be investigating the judiciary for its responsibility in what happened on October 7th.
I don't know how to follow that up. I've been trying to immerse myself in what is a truly vast literature on democratic backsliding. And there's a very thin literature on how do you push back against the backsliding. What are the methods, the means in Israel to do so? So you have a crisis impending or happening about the judicial overhaul. You have a crisis with regard to settlement activity and pressure on Palestinians in the West Bank. You have a crisis with regard to the curbing of various powers. You have a crisis with the ultra-Orthodox Haredi community. Where are the means, methods of pushing back against the backsliding to maintain the basic democratic nature of the state?
Yeah, to get into that, I want to just do one thing that I didn't do before, which is make a little plug for myself, but also an answer to your point about the vast literature on democratic backsliding. If you'll notice, a lot of that literature doesn't touch Israel. Okay, a lot of the, global populism and democratic erosion, a lot of it talks about European backsliding. A lot of it leaves out Israel, which is why I wrote The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel, Promise Unfulfilled, which came out notably 3 weeks before the war. In other words, I was writing it the year before the judicial reform that everybody was talking about. I was just editing over the course of 2023. And that goes in, that reflects what I'm saying before, that it started, a long time before. I was consumed with the problem of Israel missing pillars of democracy and judicial, demonization, et cetera, over the course of a decade, which is why I wrote the book. And then what happened on January, I think it was January 4th, when the Justice Minister announced these reforms. You know, why do you write a book? You write a book because it's burning inside you and you feel like nobody's paying attention. And then all of a sudden on January 4th, or the first Saturday night after January 4th, 20,000 Israelis went onto the street. By the next week, we had 100,000. By the next week, we had 300,000. And so it was quite, you know, a little bit, you know, jarring for me, having felt for a decade that nobody was paying attention, right? The point about people dying in dumbness. I refuse, as a public opinion researcher, the labeling the public as dumb. Okay, 25 years I've been listening to the public, whether qualitatively and in surveys. Public is not dumb. The public knows when it's being lied to. The public knows when there's hypocrisy in governance. The public is struggling with a lot of, you know, pressures, primarily economic pressures, in our case also, you know, war and conflict. And the public may make wrong choices from your perspective, my perspective too, sometimes. But there's usually a logic to them. They're usually not based on irrational, emotional, you know, considerations any more than I make my choices based on irrational or emotional considerations. The public is usually looking at very rational factors to make the decisions that we may consider wrong. So just that's a little bit of a haranguing on the side. But all to say that I was surprised that within days of having this judicial reform announced, you had such a sweeping mobilization. And what we saw over the course of 2023 was a mobilization that was extraordinary, even for a country pretty well versed in demonstrating. Israelis love to demonstrate. You know, I remember that's one time I heard the mayor of Tel Aviv talking about how when he was in high school, they had a demonstration against the teachers and some policy. I don't know, you know, people demonstrate from, they're sort of brought up with it, but this was unlike anything I'd ever seen. I went through the Carnegie Endowment's database of protest movements in other countries. They have like 800 something entries because each country may have more than one protest. This is definitely on the longer side. There aren't that many that go on that long. And then of course the war shocked everybody, but you know, people were stunned and stayed home and there was rocket fire. But even within, I would say about 2 or 3 weeks, when Israelis kind of realized there was not going to be an immediate exchange for prisoners, for Palestinian prisoners for hostages, they were back on the streets, not necessarily the same number. But you have to remember, I mean, we had rocket fire into all the central areas of the country, coming from Gaza, including in Tel Aviv, 1, 2, 3, or 4 times a day. And yet crowds began to gather, despite that threat, to demonstrate, this time for hostage release. And the mobilization that had been put into place over the course of a whole year, which took incredible organizational form, completely civic driven. The opposition politicians in Israel were kind of a non-factor in all of this. They had organized such a network that they were able to mount, first of all, donations to help with all the, you know, over 150,000 people who were displaced, soldiers who were reserve soldiers who were called up, and there were too many for the army to even absorb. So they were first mobilizing to help them, but then pretty quickly they were mobilizing to demand hostage release. And then within a few months, certainly after the first phase of the hostage release deal, when Israelis realized that there was not going to be a second phase after December 2023, January 2024, the protests began with a much more political flavor, openly criticizing the government in a separate protest. So you have the demonstrations for hostage release, then a separate demonstration that was openly blaming the government and bringing back all the concerns about corruption, about the government being committed more to theocratic, you know, its theocratic agenda and expansionism in the West Bank and annexation and protecting Netanyahu and corruption, and that had led it to the failures of October 7th. All of those critiques kind of came back from 2023 under the banner of accusing the government basically of being willing to sacrifice the hostages in order to keep the war going, in order to keep the coalition satisfied. And that became a separate demonstration. So now you have 2 big demonstrations that are going on all the time. But you will surely now ask me, these demonstrations haven't achieved much. Does that matter? Is that helping to stem the democratic backsliding? And the
That's my
answer,
question.
yeah. Not only do I know how to ask questions, as a pollster, I know how to anticipate. Of course, there's all sorts of other tactics at play. There is still robust civil society, which has come, you know, which is like you're seeing here in the US, constantly trying to go to the courts, to go to the Supreme Court, which also sits as the High Court of Justice, to try to petition, get to constrain the state. The results are mixed. The government is behaving like a juggernaut, essentially scattershot approach to trying everything all the time. So it's hard to keep up.
We're talking about in Jerusalem, not Washington.
But just remember, I mean, I'm not sure, I'm not sure how much this really holds, but I think that in the wartime situation, which is so extreme, I mean, we have never had a war like this in Israel. October 7th was unprecedented. It was the first time ever since Israel's establishment that Israel lost sovereign territory. It actually saw sovereign territory conquered for about 48 hours in the south, and arguably sovereign territory in the north was uninhabitable by civilians. So for months. So, and then we've never had a war this long, right? At this point, we can say definitively there has never been such a long war. So you have to realize the situation of the Israeli public is, really devastated, trying to keep up with what all of this means, with like fresh peaks of misery all the time. And yet civil society has been fighting back. I think that civil society is something that maybe I myself even underestimated a little bit before 2023 and 2024, but I have made a transformation. I think it is really the only source that we see for the kinds of activities, whether it's legal challenges, whether it's demonstrations. There have been attempts to call general strikes. They haven't worked out very well, but right now we're seeing university and college presidents calling a strike against the attempts to fire the attorney general. And, the government just responds that they're staging a coup against legitimately elected leaders, et cetera, but they're continuing and they're not backing down. The attorney general hasn't backed down. But civil society in particular, I think, in an inclusive way, right? Whether it's people coming out to demonstrate, led by, just regular people who took on themselves an organizing and mobilizing position, or whether it's leaders of academic institutions, or the freedom of information movement, or everybody who's trying to push back against this stuff. And some of the gatekeepers from within the judiciary are basically the source that we can see for trying to push back on some of this stuff. Ultimately, we will have to wait for elections to find out if there will be any political translation of all of these really quite extraordinary efforts. Because without that, the great example of where the limitation is the fact that so many people would like early elections or would like the prime minister to resign, and yet there's no legal mechanism for turning hundreds of thousands of demonstrators and weekly demonstrations into elections. So by the same logic, all of the public presence and mobilization can't actually transform a state's institutional nature unless there is political change. And it's just too early to predict what would happen in the next election.
So let me join you in stipulating that voters are not dumb, but they don't always vote what seems to be their interests. Okay, so I remember Shmulik, the taxi driver. This is 15 years ago.
Want to talk taxi drivers?
Yeah, everybody has a taxi driver.
We call it qualitative research.
So it's about, 15 years ago when there was the housing protests, housing shortage for young people. And I'm on the way to the airport, and Shmulik, whom I know for quite some time, is at least a Likud voter, if not further right, is railing against the Likud.
Mhm.
How can we be putting money in the West Bank into settlements when these young people don't have houses? He finishes railing and I said, so Shmulik, are you going to vote against Likud this time? He says, no, that's my team. I vote for them. How does this translate? And let's say this government goes to term. So it's October, November 2026. Does this translate into change?
It's always preliminary to eulogize Benjamin Netanyahu. My version of that, by the way, I remember having a conversation with a taxi driver some years ago. Actually, it was during the 2015 elections, because in 2015, there were a number of all of the surveys leading up to the last phase before the elections that year showed that Netanyahu and the Likud were either tied or lagging behind what was then the iteration of the Labour Party under the current president, Yitzhak Herzog. And the taxi driver said, oh, I'm so angry at them and I can't stand him and he's got to go and this is. And I said, so, you're going to vote for, he said, of course I'm going to go vote for Netanyahu. I said, why? He said, well, it's like cigarettes. They're bad for you, but you do it anyway. So that's that version. And we've seen versions of that through 5 election campaigns, through 5 election processes that happened in 2019 through to 2022. Although Netanyahu didn't win all of those. right? That's why there was so much trouble forming a government. And so we know that people change their minds, right? But the coalition system being what it is, Netanyahu's very good at taking a situation where he doesn't have an obvious advantage for his party, or maybe he, and of course, you don't need to be the biggest party to form the government in our parliamentary system. But what he's very good at is, even if, whether or not the votes are clearly favor him or give him an obvious majority, he's also the best kind of puppeteer of all the political parties in Israel. So he knows how to maneuver the parties that do get the votes back into his fold. Look at what he did just over the last few weeks. I mean, just today, he managed to bring back the party of Itamar Ben-Gvir, which had left with an ultimatum that, if you, I'm leaving because you reached this hostage deal, which involved a ceasefire, and if you restart the war, then maybe I'll come back. So he brought him back. But he also co-opted what had been up until then his biggest challenger within the Likud. And that's Gideon Sa'ar, who, was like a Likud kind of, long-term stalwart Likud legislator and minister who left to challenge Netanyahu. First, he ran against him in primaries, was routed. Then he left and said, he was the only Likud figure who was bold enough to leave and try to challenge him with a competitor party, failed miserably, ultimately had to merge with other centrist parties, broke up with them, came back to the Likud. Just came back to the Likud formally, literally 2 days ago. And so Netanyahu was very good at kind of figuring out how to take anybody who opposes him, including from close to his camp, and either putting them together so that they get more support, like he did with these two religious fundamentalist parties in the coalition, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. These are two parties that are, again, religious fundamentalists like anywhere else in the world. He managed to convince them to run together so that they would maximize their vote in our electoral system, so that he would have a basis of coalition partners that gave him more seats. He also knows how to dismantle opposition. So he dismantled, I'm not saying it was like one for one, but he knew how to kind of dismantle Gideon Sa'ar's attempts to challenge him, and now has just co-opted him to come back to the Likud. And so he's good at that stage as well. So I think that, I certainly won't predict. What I can tell you is the following. Like I said, the government crashed in the first phase of the war for about 6 months. And they had lost a third of its votes, and they were not coming back month after month after month. And that is an unusual trend relative to the rest of the world. But then we see a revival, and the revival has not brought it in surveys. And I'm talking about not one survey, but dozens and dozens of surveys that are very consistent over time. This revival has brought the government back to where it was before the war, but not to where it was on election day. So they still have not been able to win a majority of seats in any survey except their crony surveys, which is, I really put that aside for now. And yet they have, the government has just below a majority of the seats in all surveys at this point. They have recovered what they had. And so some people may go back. And even if the original constellation of parties that won in 2022 aren't able to regain the same number of seats, Netanyahu could also manage to co-opt other parties that are not currently part of his bloc to get back in. So don't eulogize him yet. I mean, this is the reality of the political system. There's also a scenario in which he loses. No question. I'm happy to walk through all of the policy positions, which I mentioned briefly, where a majority of the public disagree with him. It's between 60 and 70% who disagree with him on core existential issues, like the fate of the hostages, like the judicial reform, like a number of aspects. But the question will remain whether people are willing to vote based on those things.
How important in your research has been the question of accountability? The military they've started putting out in public their internal accountability assessment. The intelligence community has done so. And at least what we're seeing in the press, it's been pretty honest. All the mistakes they made, both in the conception before the war and then the execution of military or intelligence activity during. How important is that in the electorate's mind for the prime minister to look in the mirror and explain how for 10, 12, 13 years, he was leading a policy of essentially promoting Hamas's fortunes?
Yeah, I think that, so you asked about the electorate. So it is very, very important in the public's mind. Citizens, the support for a public state investigative committee, which would be independent and run by a Supreme Court judge, and would be appointed by a Supreme Court judge, ranges from 60 to 80 in all surveys, depending on how you ask the question. It's always a majority, it's often a very strong majority, and people are kind of satisfied or in some ways, pleased that these institutions, the IDF and the Shin Bet have been publishing some of their findings, but it's never enough. What we hear again and again, especially from the communities of Israelis who were in the southern, kibbutzim and the southern neighborhoods, those who suffered the biggest losses and were displaced, that it's not enough. They want the political answers. They want the politicians and the political leadership to look them in the eye and tell them what went wrong. And they want them to take responsibility and resign. 60% want Netanyahu to resign right now, either during or after the war. And they want that state investigative committee. So in terms of their sentiment, it's incredibly strong. Will they bring it to the ballot box? I don't know yet. But the other side of the equation is, how important is that for Netanyahu? I mean, this is not a government that feels a sense of accountability. It doesn't feel a sense of shame or humiliation at what is the biggest breach of Israeli security in history. And, people often compare, there has been a lot of comparison to 1973, surprise attack, the fact that there was a kind of paradigmatic concept that political and military leadership wasn't able to see through. It filtered all information through this paradigm, and so was unable to see the true threat that what Hamas had been planning, or underestimated the enemy for all these reasons. So there's a lot of comparisons. But I think the big difference is that there was a state investigative commission, the Agronaut Commission, to examine the Yom Kippur failures, and when it didn't sufficiently blame the prime minister and defense minister, the public went out and demonstrated. At the time, that was a mass demonstration, the numbers they had. And they demonstrated, all throughout April 1974 until the prime minister resigned. But she didn't have to resign. I mean, there's no legal mechanism to force her to resign. She felt a sense of shame. You can read about it in her autobiography. And this government it doesn't operate in the same way. Netanyahu doesn't operate in the same way. He doesn't feel he's been telling the public quite openly, you can kiss the idea of a state investigative commission goodbye. And I think with the investigations that are coming out now, from the IDF and from the Internal Security Agency, there is already, and we've seen this process many times, it is already starting to be treated as a political game. Netanyahu has attacked them for kind of attacking him. I mean, certainly the Shin Bet also tried to lay some blame on political levels and saying, well, we did our part, we warned, they kept the money flowing to Hamas, and Netanyahu is, of course, now trying to fire the General Security Services Chief Ronen Bar is part of that. So it's all part of the attempt to portray any agency of government that is not the executive as politically motivated, as having some personal vendetta, as being part of the coup, the coup of the unelected against the true voice of the people, and it always comes back to that language.
Almost a year ago, I think it was April or May, General Halevi, the now former chief of staff, said something to the effect there aren't really significant targets left to attack in Gaza. How much do you, if at all, subscribe to the idea that this war is a political means of keeping Netanyahu in power? That he doesn't have to face the music, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, given that I'm not a military expert, I have no choice but to depend on the military voices inside, the chief of staff, other military analysts, former military figures, and it's very rare to find an alternative view that there are significant military targets left in Gaza. There's been a lot of criticism about what could or should have been done differently from a military level, but I'm not able to come up with a significant argument that there's so much more to do in terms of destroying Hamas. I think most of the military experts agree that Hamas can never be completely destroyed. It will be something like a low-level insurgency unless there is a political resolution to this. So what will a full-scale resurgence of the war achieve? The only thing I can really see it achieving is advancing what senior ministers in Netanyahu's government have said they want, which is essentially a military annexation, a military takeover of Gaza. That's what they call it. There should be military control, security control over Gaza. Some will hedge that and say we only want military control, we don't want civilian control. I think that everybody should, it's time to disabuse ourselves of the idea that there is a separation between military and civilian control. We know this from the West Bank. There is no real difference between security control and civilian control. When you have a military occupation, it controls all aspects of civilian life at some level. So those ministers who are openly saying this, the most extreme, are saying very openly that they want annexation and resettlement of Gaza. There are whole movements for this. I mean, so does Netanyahu himself actually want that? I've given up trying to be his psychoanalyst. I don't know if he actually wants to build settlements in Gaza. I look at his policies. As somebody told me, somebody who was an insider in the Netanyahu, entourage told me, the people, anybody who tells you about what Netanyahu wants wasn't in the room, and anybody in the room won't talk. So I think that's been my experience for the most part. I look at what he does, and I see that he has created a coalition by choice that involves the most extreme figures who, again, are committed in a religious fundamentalist way to the takeover of all this land, and openly want that. Now, and he wants to keep that coalition together because at this point, I mean, for the moment, he's very limited in other political options. And I think that he has had a lifelong ideology of preventing Palestinian self-determination anywhere between, the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. He does not want a Palestinian state. He has been open about that for most of his career. It's not new. It goes back to, the 80s and 90s and his opposition to Oslo, and, with one tiny little sort of half an hour break when he gave a speech in 2009 with a very, very circumscribed outline for something like a Palestinian state, but he has never really gone back to that. So I would also not agree with those who say he has no ideology. He does have an ideology, and I think that any means that he can find to fulfill that ideology of avoiding a Palestinian state, he's okay with that. So if it involves accommodating religious fundamentalists who want to annex Gaza and rebuild settlements, he's okay with that too.
So he appeals to his base, and he will be able to appeal to people who are really angry at Palestinians. What are you finding in terms of attitudes towards Palestinians? Look, when Sheila and I were in Israel in December, and you couldn't say the word Palestinian. People normally in the center left, center right, just didn't want to hear the word, let alone think the next step. What are you finding in terms of attitudes about how do you solve this thing? All right, Gaza is one problem, but even if you fix Gaza in some way, you still have a Palestinian problem that Israel faces.
It's not a good picture. I mean, like I said, war leads to very belligerent and hardline attitudes, but they were there before. And I think it's important to recognize that this war, as much as it has contributed to those hardline attitudes and perceptions of the other side, it was not a reversal. Okay, we have seen the most severe attitudes in our joint Israeli-Palestinian survey with Falushikaki. We had the most severe, deterioration of perceptions of the other side mutually in our survey from December 2022. Otherwise, you wouldn't have this government elected, right? This right-wing government that's this far right would not have been elected if it wasn't reflecting already the sentiment of the voters at the time in 2022. And that's because we had a decade, at that point, nearly a full decade without any peace process. The peace process that existed in 2013-14 was, as you know, very constrained and unlikely to succeed already. Netanyahu was already in power. And so people have been living for over a decade without anything like either a sense of the need to reach a political resolution. Certainly, the idea of talking about a Palestinian state or a two-state solution has been anathema in Israeli general discourse for all of those years. And then you have cycles of wars with Gaza. 4 different wars from 2000. I mean, I consider them wars. Some people call them operations, but I say wars to distinguish them from all the smaller operations in that time. Let's say 4 major escalations between 2008, 9, and 2022. So each one makes Israelis more hardline. And I think the manifestation, I want to try to explain what I mean by hardline. You asked about perceptions of the other side. A very strong majority who do not believe Palestinians want peace. A very strong majority who believe Palestinians have extreme aspirations and they want to take over all of historic Palestine and destroy the Jewish population there. That's a long-term question we ask. And when we asked a particular question in our July survey, our joint survey, about what were Palestinian intentions on October 7th, 66% of Israeli Jews said that their intention was to commit genocide. And all of these things have practically a mirror image, nearly the same data on the Palestinian side in terms of perceptions of Israelis. Again, I'm not trying to say the situation is politically symmetrical or symmetrical in power, but these attitudes have, the data is so close that if I hadn't collected it myself, I might have thought somebody cooked it. And just, I think the main factor is mutual threat perception. The threat perception is that each side wants to existentially destroy the other side in the long-term questions we've been tracking and in the immediate sense of this war. And as a result, we saw very high justifications for everything Israel has done since October 7th, when we asked direct questions about, do you justify, for example, the use of force, how the extent of the use of force? Has it been the right amount, too much, not enough? Our colleagues over at Tel Aviv University Peace Index survey researchers found that, it was like 87% of the Israeli Jews thought there had been either the right amount or not enough. The number of, when we ask about whether you justify the number of Palestinian casualties, we have, very high levels of support for that, around over 70%, around 3/4. And again, the mutual threat perception. So that's what I can say right now about attitudes towards Palestinians. I think the big question is, your bigger question is what comes next. And one open question for me is whether, there's a lot of talk about what should happen the next day in Gaza. And it's part of what's troubling to Israelis who are actually fighting the war. We don't know where this is going, we don't know what the political aims are, we don't know how this ends. I think that all of the ideas and plans and kind of semi-plans that have been bandied about, I should say, by the international community, to some extent, not really by Israel, but a little bit by Netanyahu, a couple of documents back a year ago. I'm not sure if Israelis are able to connect that with a longer term sense that there needs to be a broader political resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and occupation. And my sense is that there is a dawning understanding, but it's still very incipient. And if you don't have influential political leaders making that connection for them, the incipient understanding will be kind of lost. Because people will be lost in their day-to-day struggles for, sanity. And I think that right now we see the political opposition barely ever touching the bigger picture. Even the head of the centrist party, Yair Lapid, who has been the last Israeli prime minister and the only one in recent years to actively support it, to publicly support a two-state solution on the international stage, which he did in September at the UN General Assembly in September 2022, has barely gone back to that. He's the only one who's actually even barely talked about it since the war, but just barely, and he's more focused now on, a plan for Egypt to kind of somehow get Gaza. I don't even understand the plan, to be honest. But I did read it, but it didn't make a lot of sense to me. Or, the head of the left-wing party, Yair Golan, who's supposed to represent the Israeli left, which supports political resolution, end of occupation, two-state solution. He's barely even talking about that bigger picture, barely. So if nobody makes that connection, how do I know that Israelis are kind of little by little kind of making the connection that there is a legitimacy to political resolution to conflict? Because it became legitimate to talk about a political resolution for Israel and Hezbollah and Lebanon, the northern border. We have a political ceasefire, politically, diplomatically brokered ceasefire in place, which is sort of held. Well, there's sort of, and there's been a lot of breaches of that. But we also know that Israelis have had a renewed understanding of the concept of diplomatic agreements through the Abraham Accords and through the possibility of normalization with Saudi Arabia, through the Biden administration's proposals to have a bigger, the Biden administration, for all that it got wrong and did wrong, it also proposed the outlines of a more comprehensive vision for what to do that advanced Israel's normalization in the region as, within that, tied up with that condition of Palestinian self-determination that has since fallen by the wayside during the Biden administration, kind of said it and then wasn't able to advance it or didn't want to take the steps needed to advance it. And so Israelis have familiarized themselves once again, with the concept of diplomatic agreements, political agreements, peace agreements, both during this current war and the few years preceding it and the possibility of future agreements. But if nobody's going to argue that convincingly with leadership from the political levels, it's going to be lost to the wind.
Get your questions ready, because right after this one, I'll turn to you all. Former colleague of mine has argued not that Israel has decided that in certain cases diplomacy may work, but that diplomacy can only work after what is called escalation dominance. In other words, if you use the military in a way that dominates an enemy, Hezbollah, Iran, then you can open up the door, at least a crack, to the possibility of possible diplomacy. Do you subscribe to that? Does that make any sense to you?
I mean, I think history shows that, the military, the military aspect of human society and interaction is part of it. I mean, usually, I think we see, there are wars and they end with diplomacy, but sometimes the war is part of that, right? Like, I mean, the classic example being World War II. The question is how those wars end. And, there is certainly a common theme in Israeli society that, Israel must have total victory. For one thing, the Prime Minister has been using this as a slogan. And there are many Israelis who think that first Hamas must be completely defeated, and there's no real definition for that, but some still subscribe to it. And they'll use the example of World War II that until they are completely defeated, until they are brought to their knees and surrender, there can be no day after plans or political resolution. But I think the good answer to that is what happens after, right? After World War II, and I learned this in a conversation that I had with Joseph Borrell, former High Representative for the European Union, former foreign minister, who told me in an interview and said this publicly. Yes, if you have total victory, you could look at World War II, but after that, the countries of the world invested in the state of Germany that became their ally and in building it. And what Israel seems to be doing in this war is continuing the war for the sake of destroying the possibility of any infrastructure that would lead to rehabilitation of Palestinian society. So I think in a way, I don't see Israel's actions right now as using its military strategy to support diplomacy. I see it as kind of ongoing military strategy for the purposes of avoiding diplomacy, for the purposes of avoiding a diplomatic resolution, at least at this point. And I think we should also put Hamas into this as well. I mean, Hamas seems to have kind of generated an approach of just fighting to the death, basically, as well. Although, over the last few weeks, we've seen any number of kind of back and forths about what Hamas would propose in response to the Witkoff proposals, which gets us very into the weeds. Hamas is both typically behaving as kind of a rational actor, even if it's a bad actor, and also undertaking behavior that is surely suicidal for itself and its people. So I don't want to discount this entirely. I think it's, not helpful to look only at one side of the equation, but I am analyzing the Israeli government's position, and I think that what I see is more of a divergence between the military and the diplomatic.
Questions? There's a microphone coming, there it is.
And I'll be happy to hear your name.
To what degree, I'm from the community,
What's your name?
but what I wanted to know is, to what degree is all of this influenced by outside powers? To what degree does Netanyahu continue this because for reasons that we don't know that have to do with the United States or et cetera?
I think we do know. I mean, he's heavily, of course, Israel's always been heavily influenced by / dependent on its greatest friend and patron, the United States. No question. I mean, I don't think that's a controversial statement, whichever side of the divide you're on. Now, during the course of this war, and certainly throughout the decades, right, America's military and economic support makes it possible for Israel to do what it does. Would Israel have other options without that? Counterfactually, and historically over the last few decades, if it really was committed to a policy, maybe, I don't know. But during the war, of course, we know that Israel is deeply, deeply dependent on unprecedented levels of American financial, economic, military, and political cover, right? Because the economic and military piece of it, we know Israel wouldn't have been able to do a lot of what it did over such a long period of time without that support, but also the political backing, right? Veto in the Security Council, etc. So yeah, Israel is certainly very influenced by that. And I think at points, Israel has also adjusted its policy based on the preferences of the Biden administration. For example, in the very early stages of the war, when there were significant voices in the Israeli cabinet that wanted to strike Hezbollah hard and fast right away. In hindsight, we don't know if that might have been, if that might have led to different results in various ways. But from what we have heard, it seems like the Biden administration was against it, and that played into Netanyahu's calculations, he himself being sort of conservative on these things. That's one example. also delaying the start of the operation in Rafah in the spring of 2024, partially because of the Biden administration's pressure. So Israel is clearly influenced by the American administration during the course of this war, whether it's the support that the American government gave or small adjustment, I would say, to how it waged the war. And naturally, since Trump won the elections, I should say, not even since Trump took office, because the first hostage release deal was negotiated, as you all remember, on 16th of January, before the president took office. And that was, of course, heavily influenced by the Trump emerging administration at the time and since then. I think what we're seeing right now, as of last night, the resurgence of major campaign of airstrikes and possibly preparations for another ground operation. All of this is clearly due to the backing and coordination of the White House, which they've already stated, I think, quite openly. And I think all of the decisions, including people laughed at Trump when he said, "Oh, I'm going to have this plan for America to take over Gaza and Palestinians are going to leave on some level." Never laughed, at the president of the United States when he says something, and especially someone like Trump. He means what he says. I will quote Masha Gessen, who I think in 2016 wrote the article about surviving autocracy and said, "Believe the autocrat, he means what he says." And Israel certainly believes what he says, because Israel has been moving ahead on plans to establish an emigration authority to facilitate Palestinians leaving Gaza voluntarily. Right? There's no, you can create the conditions where it's almost impossible to live in Gaza now, and then it's not really voluntary. But of course, that's influenced by the Trump administration. These are things that Israel wouldn't have dared to think about, really. It wouldn't even. I mean, I'm not even sure if Israel had the imagination to think about that until the Trump administration.
Yeah, it's been said that Trump believes what he says until he stops believing what he says. Believes something else the next day. Anything else? All right, I think we're up against our time. Dahlia, this has been better than expected.